So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Dr. Elena Rios, President and CEO of the National Hispanic Medical Association. We're so happy today to have a congressional briefing, our annual congressional briefing that we do in the summer to highlight policies that are happening right now in Congress that are affecting our Latino communities and all of our communities. And with us today, we have a stellar, outstanding panel. Congressman Raul Reyes, Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Gina Adams, Senior Fellow from the Urban Institute, Lydia Cardona, Climate and Clean Air Program Manager from Green Latinos, and Noel, Candelaria, Secretary Treasurer from the National Education Association. Our topic is about the importance of the Biden White House priorities to make our families whole again. And I'm going to say whole again because our Latino families especially have undergone a lot of unemployment, a lot of anxiety and stress, a lot of death and dying with the COVID-19. And I don't have to go over the numbers, but we have had up to 18.5% unemployment in our families, according to the Pew Institute in April of 2020. And Latinos want government interventions. They need help, tax cuts, tax credits, subsidies, loans for small businesses, the eviction policies, just help for meals and food through the school programs and WIC and our SNAP programs. And we also have a very large group of undocumented, and we've seen the horrible treatment at the border and in our detention centers last year. And this administration this year is really trying to turn around the importance of taking care of everybody and being more inclusive for our families. And I have to say that the essential workers, and I'm just going to end here with, and I'll make a couple points about essential workers. I think our society has realized, bipartisan, Democrat, Republican, that we can't go through a pandemic without essential workers. And do you know that just about 3 out of 4 of the essential workers are undocumented? That essential workers who work in our supermarkets, our farm workers, our meat packing plants, and we have got to take care of our essential workers to be able to grow the economy of the United States. And Latinos are going to be 1 out of 4 Americans in our lifetime in the next 20 years. And they're not all essential workers, but honestly, our families have a lot of essential workers, and they want to work, they are hardworking, but they need support from our federal government. And that's what this congressional briefing is all about. And we just had a COVID briefing last night. I have to say one thing about that COVID briefing. The major point was obesity is probably the #1 issue. Besides all this economic help that we need help on getting out and doing more exercise and having more nutrition. And there is one bill that I know the Congressman has been a part of supporting, and that's the TROA bill. And let me see, I had it right here. The Treat and Reduce Obesity Act. And I have to just say that's another way that we can help our families, is by being able to treat obesity. And anyway, I'm going to stop there. We have presentations. If there's any Q&A time, we will have time at the end. Please put questions in your chat box. The microphones are going to be muted, but our recording of this will be available next week. And I want to thank all the partners, the Casa de Esperanza, our farm worker justice colleagues, National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. We work with the National Association of Latino Organizations. It's called NHLA. And we're very happy to have partners who understand the importance of our legislative policies and the impact on our communities. So without further ado, I want to introduce Congressman Raul Reyes from California. I've known the Congressman since he was an undergrad college student at UCLA when I was a medical student. We go way back, and so proud of you, Congressman, and we look forward to your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rios. It's so good to see you again. And I have been a lifelong partner with NHMA ever since I was pre-med, a medical student at Harvard, a resident at Pittsburgh, and now as a physician, and now as a congressman. So it's just the way this world works. So my name is Congressman Dr. Raul Reyes. I represent California's 36th Congressional District in Southern California. I'm also an emergency medicine physician and a public health expert with training in humanitarian disaster aid and public health crisis. And I'm the first Hispanic physician to serve in Congress. I'm also now the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. And we have 38 members with 4 senators, and we're accomplishing some great things this Congress under President Joe Biden. It's a pleasure to be with you today at the National Hispanic Medical Association's Congressional briefing as we look to discuss Hispanics and health equity for America's families, infrastructure, and investments. And I would like to start off by thanking Dr. Elena Rios and everyone at NHMA for their leadership in empowering Hispanic physicians and providers to improve the health and well-being of Hispanics and underserved populations. The coronavirus pandemic has had a disproportionate health and economic impact on the Hispanic communities. This past year, we saw Hispanic families carry the brunt of the COVID-19 pandemic while courageously risking their lives as essential workers on the front lines, as farm workers, meat packers, caregivers, doctors, nurses, and so much more. Yet about half of Hispanics report that they or someone close to them has experienced financial or health hardships during the pandemic. Hispanic communities face unique barriers regarding access to COVID-19 vaccines and economic relief, including a lack of reliable information in their languages, the targeted misinformation in our communities, and fear of deportation, including the access issues that we see in underserved areas. That is why all 38 members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus have been working to ensure Hispanics are receiving equitable access to vaccines, economic relief, and resources that will strengthen our communities to build back better. So earlier this year, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus unanimously voted to pass the American Rescue Plan, which extended unemployment benefits and provided the child tax credit payments and economic impact payments to millions of hardworking Hispanic families. In addition to supporting this essential relief for the American people, many of our CHC members have also proposed legislation that will reduce air pollution, promote environmental justice, support clean water infrastructure, promote land conservation, protect the health and well-being of our communities, and so much, much more. And I say that because all of us understand the importance of the social determinants of health in our community's ability to live good, productive lives. And the CHC looks forward to continuing to work with the White House and national, state, and local leaders to share best practices and engaging with Hispanic communities. One of the things that we really stressed was that the usual first come, first serve method of delivering vaccines with these large vaccine major clinics or giving them in retail pharmacies, although that program has really taken the vaccines and put them in every community, that it, in general, first come, first serve really doesn't work for our communities because we don't have usually access to good internet. Many of us have to work without the means of transportation. There's a lot of information that's lacking out there. And so the message that I've been given, that many of us in CHA has been given, that the administration is starting to work towards, is that we need to take the vaccines to the people with local partners who understand the community and go knocking door to door, go to the work site, go to the housing complexes, or go to the places of service and faith in order to take the vaccine to the people. And so we also hope that strengthening relationship between trusted community partners and key players in COVID-19 mitigation efforts so that we can ensure accurate information on vaccines and economic relief, that they reach Hispanics. So thank you for having me today. Thank you, NHMA, for all of the incredible work that you do. Thank you, Dr. Rios, for continuing to be the sounding board and the advocate, strong advocate that you are. I always look forward to seeing you in my office or virtually now during the pandemic. And together we can create lasting change to ensure the promise of America is accessible to the 60 million Hispanics living across our country. And before I say thank you, I also want to give an update that we're going to move the budget reconciliation, and CAC is making all the arguments, strong arguments, why we need to include dreamers, farm workers, essential workers, TPS holders, and as many of our undocumented as a pathway to citizenship into budget reconciliation. So please stay tuned because we're riding that train right now. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you very much, Congressman. We're very happy and honored to have you here. And yes, we're counting and supporting the reconciliation process with all of the groups you mentioned that are all part of our families. So to continue the family dialogue here from the Urban Institute, Gina Adams, a senior fellow, and she will focus more on the social determinants of health and health impact of the different plans that have come out of the White House this year and Congress debating all the different types of activities that we hope we can get.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. It's a real pleasure and to be with such a great panel. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the American Families Plan and thinking about the implications that it has for social determinants of health in the Hispanic families across the country. I want to take just a few minutes to set a little bit of context. If I could have next slide, please. Just a few minutes to set this context, talk then about some of the key elements of the American Families Plan. I know my colleagues on the other panelists will be talking about other pieces of it. And then I'm going to do a slightly quick, deeper dive on the child care early education provisions, because that's actually, of all the issues, that's the one that I'm know most about. And at the end, there's just a resource list, which will probably be shown too quickly for you to grab them, but hopefully we can send them out to you later, if not before. Next slide, please. So I think you've already heard some of this from both the Congressman and from Dr. Rios, but you know, the pandemic has created some really major challenges for Hispanic families across the country. It's not obviously only a health crisis, but it's had a terrible impact on many aspects of people's lives that support their immediate health and their longer term health and well-being. It's affected income and employment and social support networks and access to health care. All of the issues that we know from the social determinants of health play a critical role in supporting well-being. And unfortunately, due to structural inequities in access to things like good education, wealth, employment, and other factors, the Hispanic community has been particularly vulnerable to the challenges created by the pandemic, especially those with lower incomes and those with immigrant status. Just to share a few little facts, just from, there's lots and lots of research out there documenting this, sadly. But for example, an Urban Institute survey back in the beginning of the pandemic found that close to 2/3 of Hispanic parents reported that somebody in their family had lost a job, lost work hours, or lost work-related income. Another study found that Hispanic women were particularly hard hit in terms of job loss, as were low-wage workers in general, in part because of their concentration in industries that were particularly devastated by the pandemic, including retail and hospitality, education, and well, as, of course, the childcare issues that we're all so familiar with in terms of the challenges around closing childcare programs and closing of schools. Another study was not broken down by race and ethnicity, but given what we know about the unemployment challenges, another study found that adults whose families had lost jobs during the pandemic were twice as likely to report food insecurity, nearly 3 times as likely to report problems facing paying utility bills, and nearly 4 times as likely to report problems paying rent and mortgage. So implications for housing, for food insecurity, et cetera. One of the things that worries that I think we need to pay attention to when we hear these kinds of studies is that all of these things happen together in a family's life, right? It's not just they just have food insecurity, but they also have these other issues. And so one interesting study if you looked across a number of different kinds of hardships, 7 in fact, in unemployment, difficulty paying expenses, not being caught up on rent or mortgage, food insecurity, physical health problems, anxiety or depression, and lack of health insurance, to get those 7, Hispanic households with children experience 3 or more of those at rates roughly twice that experienced by white and Asian families. So what we see is all of those issues have serious implications for the ability of families to thrive, to live healthy lives and for children to develop to their full potential. And when you think again, going back to social determinants of health, all of these issues play out, right? Income, employment, nutrition, housing, healthcare, ability to care for your families. All of those issues are being affected for families in a very scary way. And I just want to highlight one other quick issue, which I think gets way too much little attention, which is these issues have destabilized families. So it has made their lives very insecure and very unreliable and very unable to think about what's going to happen next. And it's also taken away some really important social support networks of family, faith communities, civic communities. All of those things together, along with employment and income, are what give people the buffers and the resilience to be able to get through hard times well. And what I found very frightening, particularly for families with kids, because we know about the importance of stability for children's development, is how all of these issues have made it so challenging for families to be stable, made it very hard for parents who are trying to protect their families and their kids. And it's very hard to have economic mobility if you don't have stability as a foundation. This is particularly frightening to me right now, given that the emergence of the variants, we now know that the future is far more uncertain than I think many of us had hoped would be the case at this point. So I think remembering the importance of stabilizing families as well as particular needs is important when you think about supporting healthy families. Can I have the next slide yet, please? So there's a lot. I'm just going to talk about the American Families Plan and some of the provisions. As I mentioned, there are many others, but they do address many of the issues, have the potential of addressing many of the issues that we're concerned about. For example, many of the things I just talked about, many of the hardships for families have been due to reduced income related to employment, lost hours, et cetera. And many of the provisions of the American Families Plan would actually make permanent the changes that were made in the American Rescue Plan around the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and the Child Dependent Care Tax Credit. The Child Tax Credit alone has been projected to reduce child poverty by 40%. If that is made permanent, that could have a major impact on the ability of families to meet their basic needs with their income. Another key provision of the law of the plan is paid leave, which protects workers' incomes and jobs when they have to take time off to deal with illness or crisis. This is really important for Hispanic families. A recent study that I ran across found that more than half of Hispanic workers do not have jobs that provide paid leave. In fact, they're the least likely of any group to report having paid leave. And it can be particularly challenging for Hispanic families, given that they're much more likely to live in multi-generational households and to report losing a job because of having to take care of a family member. Other aspects of the American Families Plan deal with other problems, like expanding nutritional assistance, given the high levels of food insecurity that we've found. A study at the end of 2020 found that 4 in 10 Hispanic families with school-age kids reported food insecurity, and almost as many reported that they were worried about having enough to eat in the next month. Also would improve access to health insurance, obviously a critical important issue that I'm sure this audience knows far more about than I do. But obviously Hispanics are still 3 times more likely to be uninsured than whites, even though the ACA has certainly made progress in narrowing this disparity. And there's going to be there would be significant investments in childcare and early education, which I'll talk more about in a second. So basically, if you look at this list and you go back to what I was saying before about the impact of the pandemic on these families, you can see that many of the issues that we are concerned about for Hispanic families would potentially be addressed if some of the provisions of the plan go through. Could I have the next slide, please? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about childcare and early education. Childcare obviously is critically important. It was even before the pandemic, it was a serious challenge for families to find affordable care that was of decent quality. The public funding that we had in place before the pandemic only allowed us to serve 15% of those eligible under federal guidelines. But the pandemic really exposed the fragility of this quote unquote system and created even a greater crisis. But programs had to close down. They had to reduce services because of COVID requirements. They had higher costs because of COVID requirements. Parents were much more concerned about having their children in some kinds of settings. So all of these things made an already unaffordable system even more expensive and even harder to find, and created even more challenges for quality. Can I have the next slide? So the American Family Plan has 2 big elements to it that are relevant for this issue. One is that it proposes $225 billion for childcare. Among other things, that would limit childcare costs for families with lower incomes to 7% of their income. It would make efforts to support quality and to support teacher compensation. major issues in terms of affordability and quality and the ability of workers, including many Hispanic workers, of course, to be able to earn a decent living. It also proposes $200 billion for universal pre-K, which would be free for all 3- and 4-year-olds. However, the plan is a plan, and it does not have a lot of details about how these things would work. So what I want to talk a little bit about now is some of the things that I think need to be part of those details as we implement it to be able to ensure that it actually supports Hispanic families in an equitable way. Could I have the next slide, please? In terms of the childcare side of things, we really have to make sure, one of the issues that's really important is to make sure that we support the kinds of options that families need. Our current system is designed in a way that makes it pretty challenging for parents in many states to use home-based childcare options. Center-based care is very important. Latino families want center-based care to the same extent that other families do, which goes against previous stereotypes. However, we also find that many Hispanic families have situations that make center-based care not an option for them or not the desirable option. One of those issues is non-traditional work hours, meaning not the 9 to 5 during the work week kind of hours. Childcare centers don't tend to operate during non-traditional hours, and it's not actually clear that parents want them to be taking care of their children at night and on weekends and for dinner and for waking up. So making sure that families have access to home-based options, that they can pay for relative care, that they can pay for in-home caregivers, is critically important, because the way we have it set up right now is that families who work non-traditional hours are kind of shut out of the public assistance. We found in a study looking at Connecticut and Oklahoma that 40% of Hispanic children younger than age 5 with working parents had parents who were working non-traditional hours. It's not an insignificant problem. So furthermore, home-based providers are far more likely to speak the languages of the families they serve, which for a family can be very important, particularly with a very young child. You need to be able to communicate with your child's caregiver. Another issue that's really important for supporting childcare for Hispanic families is that we need to make sure that families can get help paying for childcare so they can go to education and training. Right now, a lot of the funds are prioritized for families who are working, which makes sense. If you have limited resources, you're going to make sure that families who would lose their job if they didn't have childcare are going to be able to get help. But it means that families who are trying to improve their skills and their education levels, which we know is a particular challenge for the Latino community, those families tend to not be able to get childcare assistance. And it's very hard to go to school if you're a parent, if you have to be taking care of your children at the same time. We also need to make sure that families can get childcare while they're trying to look for a job. I don't know if any of you have ever tried looking for a job while providing full-time childcare for your kids, but it's very hard. So making sure that people, particularly given the unemployment situation we're seeing right now, making sure that they can access childcare assistance to be able to look for a job is also a piece of it. And then next slide. Finally, just a few things about universal pre-K. This is a much bigger conversation that I'm not doing justice to in this brief comments. But it's really important not to rely on a build it and they'll come mentality with pre-K. It is a great thing. Latino families, like other families, really want to have their children getting a strong basis in early childhood. But we've found in our areas, in work that we've done looking at places that seem to be doing a particularly good job of serving Latino families and immigrant families, is that there's some pieces that you have to do. You have to really work with trusted partners to do outreach, to make sure families know about it, to ensure language access, really work on building relationships with parents, and simplify the process of enrollment and keeping people in the program, because a lot of times those things are taken for granted, and those are the kinds of barriers that can really keep families out. So I just want to conclude by saying, obviously, we all know that Hispanic families and children are facing unprecedented challenges right now, truly horrifying kinds of realities and struggles that make my heart break when I think about them. And the kinds of things that are in the America Families Plan and then the resulting legislation could make a real difference for them, depending on how they're designed and implemented. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you. Let me just remind everybody to please put in your questions in our chat box. Gina, thank you very much. And next, we will hear from Secretary Treasurer Noel Candelaria from the National Education Association. We're so happy to partner with you. We also partner with Melody Gonzalez from your organization on our vaping campaign, our Stop Vaping campaign. But you will be adding more to the speech before on the importance of the education impact on Latino families from the New America Families Plan.
Gracias, and good afternoon or buenos dias if you are on the west part of the country. I am Noel Candelaria. I'm a high school special education teacher from El Paso, Texas, and the proud secretary treasurer of the National Education Association, which is this nation's largest professional employer organization and union. We represent more than 3 million elementary and secondary educators, higher education faculty and staff, retired educators, and college students preparing to become educators. First, again, I want to thank you, Dr. Elena Rios and the National Hispanic Medical Association for hosting this great briefing. I also want to thank who we heard from in the beginning, Congressman and Congressional Hispanic Caucus Chair, Dr. Raul Reyes, for his unending advocacy on behalf of so many communities, because we know that even though he represents California, the work that he does impacts Latino communities and students all across this nation. It is also great to be here with two other distinguished panelists who we just heard from, Gina and Lydia, who you'll hear from afterwards, to highlight some of these important themes. Because no matter our color, our background, or zip code, we all want our kids, including myself as a parent, to be happy, healthy, and have an education that imparts honesty about who we are, integrity about how we treat others, and courage to do what's right. You know, we're living in a moment in which educators are not only having to handle the ongoing pandemic and tackle the health and education equity issues that existed pre-COVID, but we're also seeing that the same lawmakers who have denied our classrooms the resources are now trying to block kids from learning our shared stories of confronting injustice. But by joining together, now more than ever, we can collectively demand that our schools have the resources to meet every child's needs, regardless of how they show up in our classrooms. Education, just like it's had on me, has a positive impact on the health of students, from pre-K to higher education and beyond. But it's not just limited to the students. It's their families and the entire communities that also benefit from great public schools. Next slide, please. So before I talk about the bills under discussion today, I want to briefly look back at a recent bill that we heard from Congressman Ruiz that was passed earlier this year, which states and school districts are in the process of allocating as we speak. The American Rescue Plan provides necessary resources so that our students, especially our Latino students, could stay healthy during a pandemic. Next slide, please. This includes the $170 billion for education to assist with safely reopening and staying open, which is what educators have been advocating for, is the safely reopening of our schools. And $7 billion for the E-rate program in order to connect millions of students online. And of course, the child tax credit to raise millions of students out of poverty. You know, as educators, we understand how all of these programs listed here, which were part of the American Rescue Plan, directly impacts all of our students and their families. So when we talk about supporting our students, we have to be intentional about how we support the adults who are with them every single day, whether those adults are at home or at school, because we need to ensure that our students have a true opportunity to fully succeed and fulfill their own God-given potential. We're extremely grateful to Congress and President Biden's leadership for those investments in the American Rescue Plan. And that's why we ask you to partner with your local union in your community as these resources are allocated to make sure that our students and our educators are getting the resources that they need through these allocations. Next slide, please. So as we look to the future, we're pleased to see that the investments proposed by President Biden in the American Jobs Plan and America's Family Plan. In our view, as the National Education Association, there's a lot there that would address the health equity, especially as it relates to our students and our educators. As we look towards the infrastructure package and the reconciliation package, it is essential that these necessary investments are in there to ensure that we have healthy and thriving communities for our students to succeed. But I want to focus on three main areas. If we go to the next slide, please. The first is school infrastructure. The Americans Jobs Plan includes $50 billion in grants to modernize K through 12 public school facilities. It's a good start, but our schools need a lot more to truly provide healthy spaces for all of our students. We support the Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act, which would invest $130 billion to help address long-standing deficiencies in our schools' infrastructure. Schools are infrastructure, and we are calling on all members of Congress to ensure that we have a robust investment for public school facilities in any infrastructure package. In my personal experience, both as an educator and as a past state president of the Texas State Teachers Association, I have seen the direct impact that air quality has on teaching and learning. You know, I had a phenomenal colleague who was an amazing English teacher. But because of the poor air quality in her portable classroom building, she and her students were constantly coughing and always complained about headaches. Soon after, one of the school years ended about 12 years ago. She was hospitalized and died of a fungal pneumonia. See, over the past 9 years as a state officer in Texas, I've had the privilege of visiting schools all across the state. But unfortunately, there are too many stories to share regarding air quality issues and overall dilapidated infrastructure, which has a direct impact on both the physical and emotional health of our students. When I hear middle school students in Port Arthur, Texas, basically cry out asking, where are the adults who are supposed to care? As he goes on to describe his dreams of one day performing at Carnegie Hall, and also goes on to describe a music room at his school with broken shelves, broken chairs, dead rats on top of shelves, one working water fountain for the entire school. And if you've ever been to Southeast Texas along the Gulf, that's not enough. And he also has limited access to instruments, but not just him, his fellow classmates. This is not what he or any student should be worrying about or be losing sleep over at night. But unfortunately, this story is not unique, especially in our most marginalized Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities. We must do better for all students regardless of zip code. Next slide, please. The second is school meals for all. You heard earlier how important that is, but as NEA, we believe that all students, regardless of income, should have access to free and healthy school meals. This would not only remove the shame and stigma for some students in poverty, but also help students whose families may exceed income eligibility but are confronting difficult times and struggling to pay for meals. And of course, it would assist in confronting a health inequity, childhood hunger. Money to expand the existing program was included in the America's Family Plan, but we are calling on all senators and all members of Congress to raise their voice and ask for the inclusion of universal healthy meals for all students as part of reconciliation. We must end the practice of only providing students a bologna sandwich or peanut butter sandwich if they don't have the money or owe money to the school for that meal. Schools and districts should not have to do annual end-of-year fundraisers to pay off student meal debt. It is irresponsible as a nation that we even have student food debt in this country. No child or student should have to worry about if they will eat that day at school. Next slide. The final ask is for the inclusion of Citizenship for Dreamers, which you heard earlier from Dr. Rios. But it's also for temporary protected status recipients, our farm workers and other essential workers who are the parents of our students. Neither plan had this, but President Biden has publicly voiced his support for the inclusion within the upcoming reconciliation package. How does this correlate with health equity? It's about the mental health issues that are associated with uncertain and unpredictable changes in immigration statuses, which are disproportionately impacting our Latino communities and other people of color. The impacts that our students who are children of immigrants and dreamers themselves, it impacts thousands of educators like my dear friend and colleague, Karen Reyes, who you see on the center of this slide and is a special education teacher in Austin. who doesn't have a permanent immigration status, and the entire communities in which they reside. We are calling on all members of Congress to include this provision within the reconciliation package. We are asking the general public, including you, to put pressure on members of Congress to ensure that this occurs. Next slide, please. We also support other aspects of the plan as well. We applaud the inclusion of 2 years of free community college for all Americans, including our dreamers, the increase of the annual Pell Grant maximum by $1,400 and the expansion of access of this program to dreamers, providing 2 years of subsidized tuition for historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and minority serving institutions, including Hispanic serving institutions. Also providing a $9 billion investment into uplifting the educator profession. Data from the National Center for Education Statistics shows that Latinos are 27.6% of the K-12 students in this country, but just 8.8% of all educators. As Latinos are becoming a larger share of America's students, we must be intentional and united about advocating for the implementation of policies and funding measures like these that can close the teacher diversity gap. As a whole, these measures would ensure that we have healthy students in higher education, as well, by extension, any family they may have. Additionally, as the National Education Association, we support establishing a national family and medical leave program, upgrading the child care facilities, increasing the supply of child care in areas that need it most, and making childcare more affordable, ensuring a minimum wage of $15 an hour, and expanding the family and medical insurance leave to cover survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and increasing and expanding the eligibility for unemployment benefits. As a union of educators, we know that strong labor protections and support leads to healthier communities, especially for our most disadvantaged communities. When we lift the families of our students in every community, we lift up our students and begin to dismantle the systemic barriers that have been in place or recently erected to ensure that every child and every student has a fair shot of fulfilling their full potential. We believe to be better as a nation and a better world, if we do this, we will truly lead by investing in all our children and their families. All in all, we are grateful that the Biden administration and the congressional leadership understand the important role that education has in all of these conversations. Without strong investments in our public schools, our educators, and our students, we won't have the strong and healthy communities that we all deserve. We invite all of you to team up with us to push these initiatives forward and look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Gracias.
Thank you, Noel. That was very well put. And thank you again for reiterating the message of all the different communities within the Latino community, including DACA and essential workers and the undocumented. We need a tremendous amount of work from Congress to help our communities. Next, we have Lydia Cardona, who's going to talk to us from Green Latinos. We've been happy to be a part of Green Latinos since it started. Mr. Mark Magana is a good friend. We used to work together at HHS. And I have to say that climate justice is so important. And we are very supportive of inclusion of climate justice within the reconciliation packages. And we know that it is part of the infrastructure bill, at least in concept last night, that was agreed upon by Republican and Democrats and voted in to have electric cars and charging stations. So there's a light there at the end of the tunnel. So Lydia, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today and share space with you all and to talk about this incredibly important topic, which is climate change in Latino communities and the importance of that in this infrastructure plan, as you mentioned. So this image that you see here before you right now, depending on where you are calling from today, this might be a familiar scene that you've experienced recently. We know that there are mega fires burning out west right now, and some smoke traveling from thousands of miles away has reached all the way to the other side of the country to places like New York City that you see here, North Carolina, where I live, making the impacts of it not isolated to where it's taking place, and bringing with it not just poor visibility like you see here, but also PM 2.5 pollution that many people with chronic respiratory conditions may not be aware that they are being exposed to right now. So if you hit next slide, please. And so it's because of things like this that we are seeing right now, and we see it in so many different forms today, as you can see in the snapshot of headlines. But it's because of things like this, when it comes to the Latino community, that we talk about climate change as not being a problem for future generations, but something that is very much part of our lived experience today. Science tells us that many of the extreme weather events that we're seeing is the result of increasing temperatures driven by human activity. And some of these headlines show you what it looks like across the country, from drought and heat waves, flooding to wildfires and hurricanes. And what is particularly stark to consider when thinking about climate change is that when it comes to moments of crises, as we have seen during the COVID pandemic, right, with cases, Latinos being overrepresented in terms of COVID cases, death rates, and job losses. You know, when it comes to these moments of crises, it is precisely low-income and communities of color that are most exposed, that experience the greatest disproportionate impacts. And that's very much the case right now when it comes to environmental and weather-related disasters. So next slide. In America, the sad reality is that race is the strongest determinant as to whether you are overburdened and exposed to air pollution or lack access to running water and indoor plumbing. When it comes to air pollution, nearly 2 million Latinos live within a half mile of an oil and gas facility. In California, for example, 44% of Latinos live in communities with poor air quality, compared to 25% of non-Latinos. So when it comes to this issue of clean air, which can vary up to 300% from block to block, you know, people often think that we're breathing the same air in a city, but that's not necessarily the case. So this cost is disproportionately borne by communities of color, as the American Lung Association has consistently told us over the years, with failing health grades for air quality in communities of color. And it's a cost often borne by our children, who, along with Black children, have higher rates of asthma and asthma-related hospitalization than white children. When it comes to environmental hazards, this is again the case, particularly when it comes to water issues. So I wonder how many of you on this presentation right now, you know, how you would feel about spending $250 a month on water delivered to you, not via your faucets and the ease of access that provides, but rather being delivered to you by a truck. And imagine that you were a low-wage worker paying that price. Unfortunately, this is the reality for many people in remote communities, not abroad, as you might imagine, but very much here in communities in America, in places like Texas and Puerto Rico, where my family is from. Latinos and Black Americans are twice as likely to be among those 2 million Americans without indoor plumbing. And similarly, when it comes to those places where our public water systems are accessible, they often fail to meet federal health standards when it comes to the Latino community. So water systems in counties that are 25% or more Latino are violating drinking water contamination rules at twice the rate as the rest of the country. And you can see that here in this graphic right below. But, you know, when it comes to these environmental issues, what is, again, you know, of interest to organizations like mine, like Green Latinos, who are thinking about this, is that we're already seeing these impacts in these disproportionate sort of burden that these communities face. And when it comes to climate change, again, during times of crisis, it is our communities who will be paying this price at a greater extent. And so we don't have to wait, you know, 20 years from now to see this. We're already seeing it right now. Latinos live and work in areas disproportionately exposed to climate-related risks. that image that I showed you at the very beginning, you know, the wildfires that are happening, recent data coming out actually in the past 2 weeks tells us that Latino residents in Western states are facing the greatest danger from the fires that we are seeing. They're twice as likely to live in areas most threatened by wildfire relative to the overall population. This has only grown in the past decade. It's very likely to continue that way. And when it comes to the industries where Latinos work, we're very much overrepresented in sectors of agriculture, construction, manufacturing, food processing sectors. These are the frontline workers that, you know, were discussed early on in this presentation. And these are millions of people working indoor and outdoor jobs that don't have the luxury of the climate controlled settings that, you know, I, for example, am enjoying right now. And they lack the safeguards to protect them from heat related illness. My own brother works in a bread factory in Georgia where there is no air conditioning. He works outside in front of a furnace in a context in which, you know, there's incredible heat and humidity. And unfortunately, this is the reality for so many, particularly farm workers, who relative to other occupations are 20 times more likely to die from heat-related causes. And so the unfortunate reality is that the majority of these are immigrant workers, these immigrant workers who we depend on for our own food security, who are our essential frontline workers. And they often have, they lack access to our healthcare system. And in many cases might be afraid to report their symptoms. So there's a very real physical, health, and economic sort of cost and intersection to all of these different issues. And what we know is that our communities are often, you know, overrepresented in terms of being low income, experience health disparities. Latinos have the highest rate of uninsured of any ethnic group in the country. And so presented with these issues that have a real economic and health impact without the ability to respond to it. And so if you'll move to the next slide, it's in great part because of this that we empirically see that Latinos are the group most concerned about climate change, more so than any other ethnic group in the country. It was also ranked as a priority topic for Latinos in the last election, according to a Latino Decisions poll. So there are many reasons accounting for this, but the most significant is this very real lived experience that we've just covered. And so Latinos across the political spectrum believe climate change is real, and they want their legislators to take action. And that's not just what evidence shows us. I can tell you from my own personal experience in a house very divided politically with my immediate family, that climate change across the spectrum is very much something that is of interest to all of us. And so that is precisely where this bipartisan infrastructure deal and the reconciliation process provide a momentous opportunity that we have not had before to respond with investments that can address the barriers, the injustices, and the risks that low income and communities of color overwhelmingly face while mitigating the drivers of climate change and making our communities more resilient to its impacts. So if you'll move to the next slide. And it's very much in response to this opportunity and to a lot of what we've seen in the past several weeks of these negotiations have been going on, and certain pieces, have been sacrificed in the process, that organizations like my own, along with other Latino groups, come together to show that we are united in articulating that climate justice, climate investments are a priority to us as a community. And we've done so in the form of a letter developed by this group outlining many of the issues that I've already discussed here, but as well as the solutions that we would like to see in any legislation that comes out from the administration and from any congressional negotiations. And so here in the slide, you see a couple of these different buckets that we've found to be important to us. It's by no means all encompassing. You've heard some other really great issues discussed earlier in this presentation by the other presenters, but from a climate perspective, clean energy is something that Latinos are overwhelmingly in support of, a transition to 100% clean energy in the next 10 to 15 years. It's something that can address the health effects of legacy pollution while mitigating key drivers of climate change. At the same time, the renewable energy sector employs 3 times more Americans than the fossil fuel extraction sector does already, and it pays 25% more than the median American job. So these are jobs that Latinos want to see access to and that they want to see localized in our communities who have already experienced so many disproportionate impacts. When it comes to infrastructure, our definition of infrastructure is quite broad because of, again, of these lived experiences and the intersectionality of all of these issues. So, for example, natural infrastructure that supports resilience is something that we see as worthy of investment as hard infrastructure. Nature distribution is unequal in America, and Latinos and other communities of color have less access to green spaces in their communities. Green infrastructure offers many benefits, including responding to mental health well-being, to heat deserts, and also supporting coastal resilience, which is important for flooding. And so, again, when it comes to clean water, that's incredibly important. And we're asking for investments in lead pipe remediation and programs that provide clean, efficient water infrastructure to all communities. Now, this is something that in some of these budget reconciliation processes we've seen sacrificed. And so, again, incredibly important for us, in delivering this letter to make sure that it's articulated why this is so imperative to our community. And one really important piece that's cross-cutting across all of this is the justice and equity element. It's incredibly important for us to see that these investments take place in communities that are already seeing the greatest harm, that they are accessible in terms of receiving those benefits in these places. And so, this can come in the form of investments in environmental remediation associated with orphan wells, with Superfund sites, access to the clean energy benefits of things like solar and electric vehicles, and making those accessible to low income and middle income communities. And ensuring that when emergencies do happen, that these funds are accessible to the poorest and most impacted, which is not currently the case. There are many barriers for low-income individuals to access those funds. And so, it's, again, the climate piece is so incredibly important, but unless that is done with a justice and equity lens and we ensure and push to see that these investments reach these communities where it is most needed, then it's not going to provide benefits to everyone equitably. And so groups like ours are calling for $2.1 trillion in climate and justice investments. And some of the budget for reconciliation has gone back and forward. I saw that it went up again yesterday, which is wonderful. We do want the majority of that to have some sort of climate and justice focus. And so this is a high level snapshot of what you will see in this letter. We are currently working on getting signatures from Latino focused and Latino led organizations and deliver this letter in the second or third week of August to congressional offices and to the administration. So if you are part of such an organization, or if you work for a congressional office, we'd love to get your support to amplify its release, or join us in our press outreach so that we can make sure that this message is loud and clear and delivered to our representatives.
Right.
And then the next slide has my email address for those who want to reach out to me.
And we'll have everybody's information. Thank you very much, Lydia. We're going to have this recording and the information slides, etc., the resource list from Gina available on our website next week. I didn't get a whole lot of questions in the chat box. If anybody wants to put in anything, please do so. But I have a general question. I'm going to start with Gina. We have a real need to educate Congress and the Senate, and all of our organizations are advocacy groups. And just to let you know, I'm actually the Health Committee chair, co-chair for the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. We've been having meetings with our Senate and Congress health committees, as well as, of course, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, which is our big champion. But I think what's important is, how do people get involved with advocacy through your organizations? Gina, do you want to start? Or let me put it this way: how can we use your organizations to help with advocacy? especially for families. Just maybe a general website and what you offer in terms of support.
Sure. So I work at the Urban Institute, and we're a nonprofit bipartisan research organization in Washington. Our information is really using data to elevate the debate. And so what we have is pretty accessible, and I'm happy to put our website on when I get finished saying this. We have very accessible information about a lot of practical research that shows the implications of a lot of the policy issues that you're talking about. So for example, some of the studies that I cited were ways of using that evidence to kind of help inform policymakers about the implications of these kinds of issues. We cover the full gamut from childcare through housing to education. I actually don't think we do as much on climate, but we have lots about kind of economic justice, racial justice issues. So I'll put our website on, and we are very focused on making sure that our products and our information is accessible and useful for people who are using it to inform policies. So we're very excited to have our information be relevant for you. So I will put our website on the link.
Go ahead and put it on the chat. Yes. Noel?
I just put in the chat, educationvotes.nea.org. You can go there and get the laundry list of all of the issues, not just the ones that I covered, but so many more that impact all of our students, the educators, and all of our communities. And you can see what bills are in Congress right now, that you can reach out and contact your member of Congress and ask your friends and relatives to reach out to them as well and share those links. You can share them on your social media, email them, text them. There's multiple ways that you can help connect with NEA and partner with our local affiliates, our local unions in our states, because there are so many of our issues that are not just federal issues, but then come down to the state and local level that we need to all be connected with and work with our local affiliates and our state affiliates to help drive all of these issues that impact all of our communities.
Thank you. Thank you. And Lydia, I know you mentioned a lot about what you're doing, but maybe one takeaway for everyone to know to help you.
Yeah, well, Green Latinos is a membership organization, and so we encourage anyone who might be interested to join and get involved with our advocacy efforts. We have working groups and many forums through which we can connect you and hopefully provide service to you and your the needs that your community might have. So.
Oh, great. Okay. And I just want to put another plug in for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, who works side by side with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Asian and Pacific Islander Caucus. I know there's caucuses probably for every issue that we've covered here, but I think it's important that the participants in today's congressional briefing get more engaged with your own assemblyman and your own congressman and your own senator. They can use the expertise of our listeners. I think that what's also important, not only caucuses and the individual offices, but we have to think about this reconciliation package as it moves forward. And whatever we can do as National Hispanic Medical Association in our government affairs efforts will be to write more letters of support for the things that we discussed today. And I want to thank everybody, all the speakers, all the staff, and all of our participants for being a part of the discussion today, and you all brought up excellent focused points about priorities for our families and our communities. This is our contact information. NHMAMD.org is our main website, and we do have government affairs there. We will be having more information about government affairs as we move forward in the year. But our conference, national conference, is March 24 through 27. We do bring in doctors and medical students and others to have Capitol Hill visits. I'm hoping it will be, that the visits will happen. We're planning a live in-person conference here in Crystal City, Virginia, and we're looking forward to that. And just like everybody else has said, we look for members because it's so important to have mentoring and leadership development within any organization. And that's what members and membership is all about. But we also offer opportunities for our members to be speakers and to be nominated to advisory committees within the federal government and also with the organizations that are here with us and our partner organizations. I think all of us need to have the Latino physician voice or Latino healthcare professional voice, especially with government affairs. As we now know, COVID-19 and pandemics have really impacted our communities, and public health is so important. People never realized how important public health was. We're going to have to find more young people to go into public health to help with the future of our country. So thank you very much, and we'll till next time. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you.